Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hey, it's Zoe, and this is the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we talk about all things people stuff in leadership. It's also where our theme this quarter is on developing others. So as leaders, our core responsibility is to develop other leaders. And my guest today is Rebecca Friese. She is a leadership consultant and advisor, and she has written her first book called The Good Culture, The Leader's Guide to Creating a Workplace That Doesn't Suck. It's a wonderful title. I think because we all know that some workplaces are fantastic. I've had the privilege of working in some fantastic workplaces myself. And then there's those that suck. We don't want to be there. And we don't want to be leaders that guide others in cultures that suck. So I look forward to sharing this fabulous interview with the dynamic Rebecca Friese. Before you get there, though, if you just take a moment to rate and review the podcast, that would be fantastic. It really helps get the word out. And so we can continue to bring leaders and authors and fabulous insights week after week on the podcast. So do me a favor. That would be awesome. I will love you forever. Okay, so without further ado, let's get on to it. Here is Rebecca Friese. Rebecca, so wonderful to have you on the call all the way from California. Beautiful place in the world. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
And the other thing I'm really super excited about is talking about culture, because it's one of my favorite topics. And there's so much to discover around it. That's for sure.
Especially today, right? In our world today. Yes. So excited. Thank you.
So your first book, it's called The Good Culture, coming out or just come out?
Just came out. It's been a little over a week now that it's been available. Yeah, the first book, the subtitle is The Leader's Guide to Creating a Workplace That Doesn't Suck. So our whole thing is about how do we help people be in work environments where they're really loving work.
Yeah, I totally subscribe to that too. I believe that we spend a lot of time at work. We should enjoy it and enjoy who we do it with.
Yes.
So it's good that we need more resources to help us make work suck less. So first question around that, what makes work suck? Let's take it from the opposite end.
Well, hilariously, this is something that I actually, when I speak to clients or I'm giving a speech and talking about this topic, I throw it out to everybody else. And, resoundingly, no matter who I talk to, no matter where it is in the world, the answers are very similar, right? Like, what makes a bad culture? What makes work suck? And they come back with answers like, well, there's not a lot of trust. I'm being micromanaged. I'm not learning anything. There's no sense of autonomy. I'm feeling stifled in my role. My manager has no sense of rapport with it, et cetera. Like, it's crazy when you ask people both to define both sides of the coin, what a good culture is versus what a bad culture is. It's pretty unanimous in its descriptions of how it feels to work in a bad culture, to work in an environment that sucks. And sadly, we're experiencing that many people in the world, poll after poll, and it's not getting better. I keep watching and hoping, but many people in the world are experiencing this at work. A majority of our workers are experiencing work environments where it just doesn't feel good.
And do you think the pandemic made it worse, better, or just highlighted the same?
It's a very good question. And somebody asked me a similar question. It's like, the impact of the pandemic on cultures. And I think the cultures that had the bones there, that were already creating good work environments, if they were able to figure out, okay, we're not in a physical workplace together for the most part. Many of us are still working from home, are still in distributed workplace, or have gone back home again. Those cultures where the leaders and the people who were influencing the culture, where they could say like, okay, if we have to replace those things that we could do because kind of inherently because we're physically together and we're thoughtful and intentional about that, like pretty quickly, they're doing fine, if not doing better. because they have found new and innovative ways to connect with their people. And there's been a heightened sense of empathy and a heightened sense of intimacy and transparency that has occurred because of the situation we're in. Now, for those organizations that were definitely not on that course or weren't aligning their culture in a way that supported their business strategy, they are struggling. It is really, really hard for them to, it's hard enough to turn it around when you are in a workplace with people every day and you kind of observe actions and behaviors and whatnot. And it's easier to kind of implement practices and policies when you're all together, for sure. So try to do that now in a distributed environment, or if you didn't care in the first place, it heightens it. So I think the divide has probably gotten wider. I think those organizations that get it and could consciously address it, and they already had some strength of culture coming into the pandemic, are potentially even gaining some huge benefits out of what has happened in the way that they've acted and behaved and kind of nudged their culture, even given, what we've got going on.
I think you're right. So people who cared about people kept caring about people through the pandemic.
Right? They knew, like, wow, this is one of those times where if I don't really focus on the people, I will absolutely lose them. Right? It's just so much going on everybody's plates. And so, I consider myself a people leader. Obviously, this is a space I'm in. I've always cared about people and work. And even I had to dig deeper I have a very small team, and even I had to dig deeper over the last 9 months to remember the situation that everybody's in as individual, to be empathetic given what was going on with them as compared to what was going on with me. Making sure I was checking in even when I didn't suspect that something was going wrong, just checking in and having it be part of the hygiene. Even I had times where I was like, right, like I need to do this. And that's what I'm all about, right? So I have a lot of empathy for leaders right now during this time. And, they're going to mess up and their own stuff's going to get in the way and it's going to be really hard. But I do think that those that, like you said, already got it, that it was, they value their people and they knew they're in a much better position for sure.
It's interesting though, like similarly, like the pandemic put pressure on our business as well. And I think, and making parallels to the leaders that I've been working with too, you go into survival mode. Like, what does this mean from a practical, pragmatic point of view? Are we going to keep the doors open?
Right? Like, how do I keep the doors open and keep the lights on? And how do I deal with my kids now being home, doing virtual learning? And how do I deal with XYZ? Like, I can't go to the grocery store anymore, whatever. And, your life being interrupted. It really is such human nature too, to just go into that very, it's all about me and my world and the hierarchy of needs, even types of stuff, right? You just get down to the basics to step back and be like, right. So, there is a lot of pressure on our leaders right now. My term for leader is very broad. It's, anybody that's influencing anybody else. Like, you don't even have to be like managing a person or an organization, but like you can be a leader and be an individual out there, right? Like there's just a lot of pressure on leaders to double down and to really find what they need in order to be able to do the work that they need to do for their people that are being influenced and inspired by them.
So when you talk to leaders about that, to find that inner resourcefulness when they need to go into survival mode too with their families, what do you point them towards in terms of finding the access to that, remember to think about others and have strength for others? How do you encourage them?
It's a really good question. I just got off the phone with a woman who her name's Amy Tyrion, and her expertise is around mindfulness and well-being, and really that understanding, the science behind your brain and pathways and how you can actually like rewire your brain if you pay enough attention and you have enough practice and you really bring these things into your life. And the reason why I was talking to her is because I'm launching a program of women executives, and I want to start with that. I want to start with, how do we first and foremost make sure that we are being mindful, that we are taking care of ourselves, that our mind is such a powerful thing on everything we do, not just our own, ability to influence others or lead others, but also our health and our, just our ability to get through the day, right? Like if we're not taking care of that first and foremost, how do we expect us to be able to do all these other things, especially when all those other things seem to have quadrupled in this past year, right? There's always a lot of pressure on leaders, but we're just seeing such extreme levels of stress and just people being stretched left and right at home, at work at home, the whole thing. So I do think that it starts there, like really, even with very small practices. This is something that I'm personally working on myself. It's not something I've ever been good at. I'm a go, go, go. I'm a back-to-back meeting person. Just those small practices around, what are those things that I need to support myself physically and mentally that will then, and I will know I will be a better person and leader and mom or whatever those roles are in my life, right? So I think that's first and foremost. And then the second tool that I've been talking to leaders about is a really simple thing, which is what I'm calling just the check-in. And it's just having a practice of asking your team, your people in your life, whatever, just literally asking, how are you? On a consistent basis, and letting there be space for that conversation. And it's funny because it's something I learned at Workday. We were visiting Workday on one of our journeys, and we were talking to the culture ambassadors. They had this whole team of culture ambassadors that go out and help with all the cultural programs and rollouts of things around their values. And we were just asking them, like, well, what makes Workday a great culture? Why do you guys love working at Workday? And almost every person said it was because people care about us. They really care about us. And we asked another question. We said, well, how do you know that they care about you? They said, because they ask. They're like, literally, like half of them were like, I've never been in an organization that asks me more like how I'm doing. This one woman was like, it was shocking at first. I was like, I'm fine. Like, what? What's like, I'm great. But she realized that it was because if you start with that, like, how are you? How are you doing? It starts with like this care, that everything else is easier from that point on. A, you really get to check in and take a space and get present in that moment with that person. But B, it allows for this pathway of conversation that wouldn't have happened if you just jump into the agenda or the work or whatever it is, right? And C, it allows for you not having to intuit when people have stuff going on, right? So, I think as leaders, we think that we're supposed to just kind of know when somebody's having a hard time, or they're like, or we expect our people to tell us. Those things are very often not true, right? I can't read your mind, and you don't always tell me because it's not the right time, or it's not appropriate, or you feel you're worried about telling me. So like giving that pathway to people. So first and foremost, taking care of yourself. And then secondly, just simply, creating this kind of culture of caring by just asking how people are doing on a regular basis. It's super powerful and simple.
I think the other aspect to that too is, as you alluded to in your answer, is that if people feel safe to talk about how they feel, then that's going to happen. If they don't, it doesn't matter how many times to ask, how are you?
Oh, right. I wish that your listeners could see my face, because I was like, yes, like you can ask somebody how they are, but if they don't trust you, if you haven't shown that you can accept that information in a genuine way and be helpful and understand content and be empathetic, they're not going to answer you. So what's the path to that, right? The path to that is, in my opinion, there's two sides to this coin too, is around both being vulnerable and being grateful. So I think what we find is trust is created by others seeing that you're vulnerable, others seeing that you're appreciative of their efforts, that you see them, right? There's a lot of aspects, but I feel like vulnerability is like the one huge lever in. So why would I tell you anything that's going wrong in my life or anything that I'm having a hard time with if you have never shown me that you have things that are hard, or you have challenges, or that you don't always know the answer, right? Like it makes it really hard for me to trust you if I see this kind of like veneer of perfection, and or even the opposite, like when things do go wrong, that it's not acceptable, right? So there's this kind of vulnerability / proof point. And then the grateful part is about, I think when leaders think about what they're grateful for, it puts them in a place of really seeing a whole person and like what they're grateful for from a contribution standpoint, from just a personality standpoint of being on your team or whatever that is. Like there is this lovely thing that happens when you step back and you think about gratitude, and then you think about vulnerability, that opens up these pathways for people to really have those conversations. So you couldn't be more right. Like if that groundwork isn't laid already from a trust standpoint, those how are you conversations may be very stiff and don't give you a lot of information. However, I do think if you continue to ask how are you, it actually might lead to that trust, right? You might get there the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time, maybe not, but you might get there just by opening that door a little bit, right?
I think that's possible, yeah. By persisting, you can demonstrate that you actually do care.
I do care. I keep asking you. I really do care.
A question I had around the vulnerability piece is how should leaders balance talking about their emotions as well as being strong for the people? Like I have a leader who talked about I need to be strong for the people and also be accessible. What's your recommendation in the balance between those two?
It's such a good question. I have people who have said this to me about their personal lives even, like, I can't show my kids that, like, I'm struggling with this because I don't want them to see that I'm not gonna be there for them, or I'm not, it's a very interesting thing that we think that strength is only in, what's the opposite word of vulnerability? Perfection. I don't even know. Like it's very interesting that there are leaders or people that believe if I show that things aren't great, that I don't have it handled, that it's not perfect, that then people will lose faith in me. Where everything we've seen is the opposite. Like if you as a leader can show, it's not to say like, I'm falling apart, like I'm completely stressed. Like, of course, that's not the but to be real with somebody, right? Like, of course, if you're telling that story, yeah, I'm going to lose faith in my leader. But like, if you're like, hey, I need you guys to know that this week is a really hard week for me at home. I've got this going on and this going on. I might not be accessible. And I just want you to know, like, I'm accessible from here to here, but I might not be as accessible as normal, or I'm having, or hey, you guys, I'm having a really hard time with this problem. I'm working on it. It's not easily solvable. And oh, by the way, like this client's really mad at us or me because I did this, but I'm fixing it. I think that the reality is we all know that nobody is perfect. No one's perfect. And we don't trust those that hide things that aren't going well, right? Because we know that not everything can be going well. So the leader that shares, the challenges that they have and how they're working through them is going to create so much more trust and be so much more inspiring, because then they can be like, okay, great. I'm not like a loser because I'm feeling this way or this stuff's happening to me, but not my leader, right? Like it's creating that pathway of identification and an ability to admit that you're not perfect, because we all know that nobody is. We all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. And isn't it so much better if I can be able to share that and say, like, you guys, I know I'm really good at this, but this part, this is happening and I'm struggling with it. And maybe even get help from your team. I mean, gosh, like, isn't that the best? Because then they feel like they can have impact and really help. And those are the leaders that people love, is the leaders that really involve them, that trust them, that can share what's working and what's not working, and even take advice and contributions and help. Like those are the leaders we love to follow, right? The ones that it's
Yeah.
participative. It's not like I'm over here and you're over there.
I think the key distinction that's important in this discussion around vulnerability, and you used one of the words that I like to use too, is the difference between being raw and real.
Love that.
I think raw is when we're just emotional, carried away by emotions, and real is the way you just demonstrated it, right? So it's like, I'm having these issues, and there's emotions there, but they're not in the driver's seat.
Right. Oh, that is so perfect. You articulated that so well. And it actually reminds me of a conversation that we have about empathy a lot of times, because we've had leaders say, well, if I'm empathetic, I'm just letting them kind of roll over me with their situation, right? They are equating empathy to excuses or being kind or being just really nice to somebody. It's like, no, that's not what we're saying here. Being empathetic is around understanding context. And then what you do with that information, given that context, right, is the key cornerstone of an empathetic leader, versus ignoring the context, versus ignoring, like, putting yourself in that person's shoes and understanding how they got there, right? So I feel like it's the same kind of discussion. It's like when people say I'm being vulnerable, I'm not saying that I want you to like call me up and then cry about all your problems on the phone with me. Like that is not, nobody wants that. It's okay. But I want you to be real. I love that. Raw versus real. Can I borrow that?
You can totally bore it.
Love it.
Yeah, and I think it's thinking about Brene Brown's work on vulnerability, and I think the word vulnerability still hasn't been reclaimed as a strength, and I think it's still associated with weakness. Another description of what we're aspiring to, this whole real thing, is from Mark Divine, and he said it in one thing I watched him do, and he talked about being open-hearted. And I think that's a really wonderful picture of what we're after as well, being open-hearted, not like a slathering mess,
You're open to new experiences, new views, new, context, new everything. I think being open to all of that is the key. And I think that's why I do like that simple structure of like leading with that question of how are you? Because you're being open to whatever that answer might be, right? Like it just is this pathway to being open, and you showing that like, no, I'm inviting you. I'm inviting this conversation, which is super interesting. Open-hearted is such a good way to look at it. I had a coaching practice where all our work was focused on coaching, and I used to say like leading with love is like the best thing you do. Now, it's another one of those things that people are like, oh, okay, like that's so woo woo. Like I can't lead with love. I've got these tough executives, and I'm like, but that's the softer version of that, which is being open-hearted, right? But that was my point. Is like if we lead with love, if we lead with caring, if we lead with this open-heartedness, it's leading with, a people-centered focus about we're all in this together. Like, don't we all want to be happier and working better and being more proficient? Like, isn't truly like that the goal for everybody? Of course, there are people out there, I'm sure, that they believe that you squash one to get ahead, right? But for the most part, I think we all agree that if we're all happier at work, we're all going to be, or in lives, it's going to be a better place to live in for all of us, right? So I feel like that whole open-heartedness and lead with love is a really good North Star, but your phrasing of it or Mark Divine, his phrasing of it
Mark Divine.
Mark Divine might
Yeah.
be the right way to lead with that.
And what's interesting about Mark Divine, he's a former U.S. Navy SEAL, so he's one of the badasses.
Right. And so if he can say it, you guys, like, come on, take it on, right?
It's really interesting, about the U.S. Navy SEALs. I interviewed Chris Sinog, former U.S. Navy SEAL, sniper teacher, about leadership. And actually, he thinks that love is one of the most important characteristics of leadership. And he says there's nothing stronger in the universe than love. And he says, I'm motivated every day by love. And I was like, holy cow, it's not what you expect
No.
in your vision of what a SEAL is, but that's what they come, or some of them, two. My extensive survey of two.
But obviously there's a theme going on there. I mean, it is interesting because, and this is where, you think about female leadership versus male leadership. I don't particularly think that there are characteristics, maybe one or the other is more well positioned. Everybody can lead with love. Everybody can, but we as women, or at least identify as women, are in a position where it's more acceptable on one hand because of our history of being the nurturers and whatnot, versus male identity, where again, these are all gender identity things that we're trying to shake off in a lot of ways. And we're dealing with multi-generational at work now, where it's so interesting to see these influences coming up, right? Where I'm pretty sure Gen Z and a millennial have no problem talking about leading with love, like most of them.
That's true.
Right. And I think some of this is just stuff that we're kind of like squeezing through and working through as we go. Right. And I'm Gen X, so I'm kind of stuck in the middle. I like to call myself there's a term for like in between Gen X and millennial. I'm squarely a Gen X, don't get me wrong. Like I'm on the upper echelons of that, but I identify as a millennial, and even Gen Z sometimes, just in my approach. And for me, it's just so exciting to see the openness around all of these notions and new skills, which I've always seen as like the skills, right, for leaders and organizations and whatnot. So I find it really exciting when I think about that, because yeah, you wouldn't expect a Navy SEAL or two of them to be talking about love, but maybe, the Gen Z Navy SEALs are, it'll be on the front, postcard of what they talk about as far as what they lead with.
Yeah. And for both of them, it comes back to purpose. And when you ask why are you doing things, and digging deeper and deeper, it comes back to love, and what do you love? Who do you love? And that's what motivates you to do the things that you need to do to endure the tough times. And I think that's a useful paradigm for any leader to think about, is the digging deep to the real why for you. I want to ask you an origin question for you. I mean, you talked about, I'm a people leader. None of us spring out of the womb as people leaders ready to charge forth with a gang around you. When was your first realization that you could be and were a people leader?
I don't know. I might have come out of the womb that way. I don't remember not wanting to lead people or work with people. It's funny because when I think about leading people, it sounds a little more like in front of them. But
Yeah.
for me, it's always just been about the focus on people, period. It's always been there. And so I have always taken leadership roles from like the very beginning of time, from the first time that I could have actually like had a leadership role in anything, whether it was a job or student activity. There was a class I went to Penn State. There was a class at my university. At the time, I'd already risen to quite a few leadership positions. I was the president of Panhellenic Council, which is the governing body of the sorority system. And Penn State at the time had the largest fraternity and sorority system in the country, in the world. So it was a big leadership position. So it's already obviously like, this is a thing for me. But I think the click for me around it being about organizations and people, and the people being the most part of it, was this class. And it was a Counselor Ed 101, I think it was called. And it was around group dynamics and organizational dynamics. And it was the first time I ever took one of those like Myers-Briggs personality tests. It was the first time we talked about like different roles that people play in organizations and within groups. It was the first time that like these notions that I'd been kind of swirling around for a while really hit me. And I was like, this is a thing. Like, running organizations is about the people, and there are ways to do this. And it kind of hit me on the side of the head. This thing that I'd been kind of doing all along really hit me over. Like, I was like, okay, this is it. Like, this is my love. And I still didn't know how that articulated into a career, except maybe HR. I was like, I don't even know what HR does at the time. I mean, this is a while ago, right? I was like, I don't get as much as recruiting. I still didn't quite understand that. And I ended up getting lucky enough to have friends who before me had joined Anderson Consulting, as Accenture now, but at the time was Anderson Consulting, and they joined this group called Change Management. And they identified it for me. They said, this is your job. This is what you need to do. And they're like, just show up and, come to the presentations, do the interviews. We promise you'll love this stuff. I kid you not. Like, I had other people identifying this for me. So I don't know if that completely answers your question, but the path that I got put on really was like, I already had a natural inclination for leadership positions. And then I got put in this class, and it kind of hit me over the head about this like love of organizations and people. And then that first job was the thing that just solidified it for me, working in change management at Anderson. I was like, that's it. And it was other people that found it for me.
Lovely. So our theme for the podcast this quarter is developing others as leaders. And so I think one of the primary responsibilities of leaders is to develop other leaders. What are your key pieces of advice for that?
Oh, that's good. So I talk about in the book, it's, when you talk about creating a good culture, there are, first and foremost, you have to have clarity of purpose. So we already talked about that. Secondly, you have to bring that down into some sort of code that's translatable for people. So what is your value system? What's your culture code? How do you articulate that purpose in the way that work gets done, right? In your value system, or whatever kinds of, articulation you come to that works for your company. But then the third piece for me, and this is why I love that this is your topic, is there's some essential actions that if you do nothing else, you should focus on these things in order to create this culture that aligns with your purpose. And the first and foremost is around recruiting. The second is around onboarding. And the third is around development. And I have a core belief, and this is backed up by tons and tons of stats, that if you don't focus on the development of people, you're going to lose all around. As a leader, your team is not going to do well. The individual will likely leave you. And obviously then your organization won't do well. And it is crazy when I hear people say things like, hey, we don't have time for these training programs and development because we've got too much work on our plates. Like, it's such short-sighted thinking, because at the end of the day, if you don't take the time development, like, that stuff doesn't even matter. Like, people will leave. And development can look and feel very different, right? So what is development? Development to me is, the ability to take a person on a path where they are challenged, where they are learning, and where they are growing, right? Like, period. That can happen in a lot of different ways. So it doesn't have to be a huge investment. People get scared and they're like, oh, is this some big program that I have to put people through? No, it does not have to be that. What development is understanding the needs of your person, both from a skill development in their role, but also from a personal, professional development, like beyond. And, having those conversations and then helping enable that, right? So as a leader, how do I enable the growth and development of a person? And not just think about it as very singularly around like, oh, okay, Lord, there's this next role that I want them to get into. So what steps they need to take that? It's like truly like considering the whole person and what's going on with them, what their capabilities are, what their desires are. Not to say that like we have to just give them everything they want and need, but like really trying to find that sweet spot of, what's going to help both them and us because it's a mutual contract. And then the how can look a million different ways. It can look from everything from like, hey, come to this meeting and just listen. It could be pairing them up with somebody else in the organization to do a little project with. It could be a training course. It could be a book. It could be, sending them to a conference. It could be taking them to a conference with you or a dinner with a client. I mean, it can look and feel like so different. The core of it though is that conversation again, and getting back to like believing that development is good for everybody, even if that person ends up leaving eventually because the way that they developed no longer suits the needs of your organization. You have to believe at your core as a leader that it is good for everybody, no matter what. And then secondly, really understanding the bespoke needs of that person and being creative about how to fulfill those needs.
I like that, the creative part, which is interesting.
I think I kind of led with it because I think people get scared. They hear development and they think, oh, I'm going to have to spend all this money on training or whatever. And I'm like, it's not necessarily about that, right?
Yeah. Though I think training is good too.
Oh, of course. Do not get me wrong. It's core part of my business, right? Like I absolutely, that was actually out of the gates. What I started doing at Anderson was mostly training, but it's one piece of the puzzle.
That's right.
It's one piece of the puzzle. And there's so many other ways to learn and grow and be challenged and be developed. And I put that all under the umbrella of development, really understanding what person needs and then the how, like you can get creative with that.
You talk in the book about metrics for culture, and I think this is an interesting one. People have been trying to measure culture for a long time. What's your insights around that?
Right. So that is the last essential action is if you're not actually figuring out where you're trying to go and then measuring if you're on your path and getting there, then you're just doing a bunch of actions and you don't really know what's going on. So I have always been a big believer back in the coaching days, early on when, somebody sets a goal, it's like, well, you have to know when you've gotten there, right? You have to know when you've achieved your goal. So if you can't articulate what that end state looks like, feels like, how you're going to measure that, it's almost not even worth it to put the goal in place to begin with, right? Because you just never know when you're going to get there. And it makes it much harder to figure out the path if you don't know where you're headed. So I apply that across the board to culture too. So, if we go back to like defining what's your purpose and your values, within that, you should have a pretty clear vision of what that looks like. How are people behaving? What I like to say is the proof points. So you're saying that you're an innovative culture. Okay, interesting. Or that you're trying to be an innovative culture. Okay, what does that mean for you? Does that mean you've got X amount of more products and services in the pipeline this year? Does that mean that people have articulated they feel like they can bring up new ideas? Does that mean, is it a qualitative thing? Is it a quantitative thing? So really kind of peeling that onion on, so what is the definition of that word and what does it look like when it's happening? And again, it could be qualitative or quantitative. So I go back to, what did you define that your purpose was? What did you find your values were? And how do you know that you've gotten there on any of those, right? And then that's where your measurements need to fall from. And you should have all that kind of thought of before you start doing any sort of programs or policies or procedure changes or whatever it is. Because again, if you're just going to put these things in place hoping that it's going to nudge you towards something that you don't even know what it looks like, you're going to spend a lot of time and money and not even know if you've done the thing. You can be like, I think we're better. I think we've moved the needle, but you can't point at it. So it's really important to kind of break that down. But I can't be incredibly specific about metrics. I mean, obviously there's surveys and whatnot, but there's different mechanisms, right? But because when we define good culture, it's not the same for each organization, right? A good culture is one that aligns with the strategy, that the way in which you work supports the work getting done that needs to get done. And that could look very different depending on if you're sitting at a Disney or you're sitting at an SEC. Those things can be very done. So therefore your measures will be different because what you're looking for from a behavior and action and mindset standpoint is going to be different depending on the organization. It should be different.
It should be different because every organization has got its unique purpose and values. What then do you think about engagement surveys?
I'm going to pause for a second on this. It's until we find something better, I want them. I want them still. I think, so much is in the execution, right? There are organizations that execute beautiful, brilliant engagement surveys, and they get tons of value out of them. And there are organizations that just cut and paste engagement surveys from other organizations or whatever, software they bought, and it wasn't custom made for them. They don't know what to do with the data. They don't do anything with the data. And then it's the exercise in and of itself actually ends up being a really unhealthy thing for the organization, right? So it's almost another proof point of like, we don't have it together, right? So there's places like Workday and Kronos and Google who are expert at surveying their organizations in different ways that provides real data that informs programs, and they can kind of move on a dime with that feedback. And so much so, and the organization recognizes that and they know that, so they participate, and it becomes a very like self-fulfilling circle, right? Like it's okay, we know that they're using this data, we've seen the output of it, and we've seen the changes that are positively made, so of course I'm going to continue to give feedback, right? So it becomes this virtuous cycle up versus the like cycle of doom where it's like, I literally just had a conversation with a client, will not name them, who they took a survey like in March and are scheduling to talk about the results in January of 2021.
Oh my God.
And she was like, you should just throw it away. This is the HR person I was talking to, was like, she's so frustrated with the leadership because she's like, that data is old. People are going to just be mad that you're, just throw it away, start anew. Like, so that's why I pause on that, because, I'm not just going to say like engagement surveys are good or engagement surveys are bad. I think when used well and custom fit for the organization, and then you are responsive to the data and you know how to use that data because you developed an engagement survey to solve your challenges versus just cut and paste one, it could be brilliant. Or it could be a total disaster. And I've seen a lot of disasters.
I think it comes back to one of the things we were talking about at the beginning around trust and so on, and the proof point of
That
trust.
can
If
be,
you ask,
yep, it can go up or down based on the survey, right?
that's right. If you don't close your feedback loop, like you ask people for their inputs and you don't do anything with it, it's like, well, trust is broken there.
Yeah, I'm never going to tell you again. Or the worst is, I think the worst is not hearing anything, for sure. I do think that I had a friend of mine tell a story about, she had just joined a company and they had sent out this whole big thing about a thing that they were doing, and they're like, feedback welcome, and like asked everybody, just email it in. She literally, so she's like newbie, she sends in her feedback, she's super excited about it. She's like, this is so great, they're open to feedback, that's one of their values, like that they're constantly learning or something like that, right? That it was connecting up to. She gets an email back from her manager. It was like, no, we don't do that. She's like, what do you mean we don't do that? She's like, no. She's like, we say that we're open for feedback, but we're not really open for feedback. Like literally told her. And then she went to some of her peers and they were like, oh yeah, no, nobody gives feedback. And she was like, trust blown. There was now you have a discord between what's said and what's done as well, right? So we want feedback. No, we don't, and she felt like an idiot. She felt like the squeaky wheel, the only person that gave feedback on something. They're like, who is this Maria girl? Sorry, I just named her, but she knows who she is. But it was a really funny, proof point of a discord in a culture, right? Where they ask for feedback, but they really don't want it. Right.
Oh, that poor girl.
She's doing fine. She has very much moved on from that organization.
That's not the usual case. Like the more common thing is like you fill out the survey and it just goes into the black hole. You don't hear anything.
Right. I was actually like, well, at least they admitted it. At least they were like, oh yeah, we don't do. At least they're being transparent about the fact that they actually don't take feedback. So funny.
1 plus.
1 plus. I'll give them 1 in the plus column for being transparent at least.
Okay, last question. So leaders are listening. We've heard about the fundamentals for culture, the core essential steps. We've learned about how to grow other people and what development looks like. What's the top of mind thing that leaders should keep in mind when it comes to culture?
Top of mind, top of mind is that you absolutely can have influence no matter where you sit in the organization. I think this is something, especially now with so many of us being distributed and people feeling a little like what do I do? Just remember, you as an individual have influence on your team, on your peers, on, your organization, even if you don't feel like it's big, because you just think about it back to that whole, it starts with the individual thing, right? I just want people to have hope. I feel like there's a lot of again, like you said, we all go into this actually, I'm not sure if you were saying this, we was having a conversation earlier about we all go into this panic mode, right? And then we kind of forget what's in front of us and what we're capable of. And I just want to give people a little bit of hope that, look, you have influence. Every conversation you have can either be a plus up or, a minus down when it comes to that person's experience, that person's day, that person's outlook, right? So don't you want to be part of the plus up? Don't you want to be that person that can take that little step? And if we all just focus on that, we're going to move mountains, right? It reminds me of the Who in Whoville, that was the final Yelp that made them be heard in Horton Hears a Who. It's they were all yelling, they were all screaming, but it wasn't until his final Yelp put them over the top so they could be heard and their whole community didn't get smushed, right? So I'm like, you might be the final Yelp, you might be the final Who that makes somebody feel good or heard or have the impact that they want to have, or move your culture the way that you want to move it. So don't forget.
I think that's a great way to finish.
Yeah, perfect.
Dr. Seuss quote.
Yeah, exactly. Be the final Yelp.
Be the final Yelp. I love it. Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insight. And where can people find you?
Great. So the book is thegoodculturebook.com. So that's easy, thegoodculturebook.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's Rebecca Friese, Friese, and I assume we'll have links and stuff. And then our website is flynnconsulting.com. So it's FLYN consulting.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is fantastic. I love talking to you.
Me too. Well, that was fun. I love the conclusion. Just be the last Yelp. I love that. We can have influence. We can create positive change in others and the workplace around us. So always feel free and able to show up and be a positive influence. I think that's a great message. If you want more of this kind of impetus, enthusiasm, support, then consider joining Amplifiers. It's my high-level leadership program where leaders of like mind gather to talk about the most difficult challenges that they're having in their leadership game. And we aim to level up the leadership game, to expand your thinking, your energy, and your practice. And leaders gather from around the world quarterly for a one-day immersion, virtually if you're dialing in from remote areas other than Canberra, or live in Canberra if you happen to be on our doorstep. And in between times, we have webcasts. So I would love for you to be part of the program and to level up the game and be part of our game. If you're interested, join us. Check out the website at zoerouth.com. Click on programs and find our Amplifiers program there. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.